Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the GLAS Hour. Denis McClean here, and it's hard to believe that it's now just over a year since we managed to have our last live event. Howie the Rookie with two splendid actors from Dublin, Stephen Jones and Rex Ryan. I hope they're keeping well. It can't be easy for anyone engaged in live performance to keep body and soul together during these times. But the curious thing is that over the last year, we've actually put on more events online than we would normally manage to do live. And tonight, we're honored to have with us a fantastic writer whose name will be new to many of you, Robert Jones Jr., who's just published earlier this year a fantastic novel, his debut novel called The Prophets. And I've actually just finished reading it this weekend. And I was saying to Robert in our brief chat before we went live that I cannot actually remember the last time I read a book that hit me with such force. It was almost like an event every time you opened the book to start reading it again and take up the story, narrative. It's beautifully written and it packs a real punch. There's a fantastic plot running through it. But more than that, it's a beautifully written narrative, and it's not surprising to hear that it actually took Robert 14 years to write this book, to produce this book, and it's paid rich dividends, at least in terms of the critical acclaim that it's received. Just looking at some of the reviews, extracts from them on the back of it. Marlon James, who wrote A Brief History of Seven Killings, says, "How devastating and glorious this is, epic in its scale, intimate in its force, and lyrical in its beauty. The Prophets shakes right down to the bone what the American novel is, should do, and can be." So, Robert, you're very welcome to the GLAS Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Denis. It is a pleasure to be here.
So you're joining us from New York, Robert, is that correct?
I am in Brooklyn, New York. It is 2 p.m. In the afternoon here, so you're in the future and I'm in the past.
Well, you're not too far behind us. You're ahead of us, in fact, because I saw on your Facebook page, on your wonderful Son of Baldwin page, that you've already given an early review of the Meghan and Harry interview last night on Opera.
My goodness, what a experience that was. My husband was actually born in England. He's from Hackney. And we were watching. I'm not really interested in the royals or any of that. It seems so very.
That's what we all say.
It seems so very archaic to me, so old and archaic and weird to still have kings and queens and princesses and such. But I was also oddly curious about the ideas of privilege and wealth and race and gender, and was not disappointed by all that I had seen and witnessed, and was not really shocked by any of what was revealed.
Well, what do you think was revealed, or what was confirmed by the interview?
Well, the fact that an empire is going to do wicked and cruel things, that they are going to treat people as objects, that the way things look on the surface matter more than what they mean, or what's inside, that money comes before people. These are all the things that empire is really good at, sort of institutionalizing.
You think the British Empire lingers on in some shape or form?
Yes, I mean, it's transformed so that it's more palpable for the times, but it is still the same. We're at the British Empire, the American Empire, the European Empire. It's empire is empire, and it maintains its grip on our lives, the ways in which we are pit against one another to ensure that we do not really attack the problems at hand. It's a very successful strategy. Divide and conquer has been for centuries.
So, Robert, tell us a little bit about your own background and your upbringing, and what were the forces that produced such a powerful writer and such a wonderful book?
Oh, thank you. I am African American, born and raised in New York City. I am the child of enslaved Africans. My father's side of the family can actually trace our lineage all the way back to the continent. And my ancestors were first enslaved in England and then brought to the United States in the 1800s. I am a late bloomer in that I always knew that I was a writer from a very young age. My father bought me a comic book with the character Wonder Woman in it. Wonder Woman, for those of you who might not know, this is Wonder Woman.
We all know Wonder Woman.
who I still adore to this day. And I was so fascinated by this comic book and the world in which this character lived that I started to write my own stories based around her, with me as her sidekick when I was about 6 years old. And from that moment, loved writing, but never thought of myself as a writer because I didn't have any examples until much later in my life that a Black person like me from humble beginnings, I lived in the housing projects of Brooklyn for most of my life, that I could actually be a writer. It wasn't until I was about 16 reading Terry McMillan's Mama that I realized that a Black person could in fact write their own stories about their own life, and that our lives were worthy of this endeavor. And I attempted my first novel at age 16, and that wasn't very successful, and it wasn't very good. And still did not have the confidence to call myself a writer. It wasn't until watching the Oprah Winfrey Show at the age of 31 and hearing one of her guests say that we all have a purpose and that we have been running from that purpose for so very long because we were told, or we believe that the things that we truly desire were not things that we could actually have. And so he went about saying that to sort of embrace your purpose, you must first understand not to think of the last step, but think of the next step that you have to take in order to make it a reality. And for me, that next step was to go back to school, to go to college and receive a degree in creative writing, which I did. And I did so well as an undergraduate student that I decided that I would continue my education in grad school. And it was in that first semester of grad school, because of an assignment given to me by my fiction tutorial professor, Stacy D'Erasmo, that I decided that I would write a tale about two enslaved young men on a plantation during antebellum slavery who are in love, because I had never seen anything like that before in any of the works or any of the canon that I have read.
You must have been listening to Toni Morrison. She said, if there is a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it.
Oh, that is absolutely true. Toni Morrison is one of my great inspirations. And she is, in fact, the one that said that if you cannot find a book you wish to read, you must write it. And that is partly what forced me to do it, because I was terrified to do this because this was uncharted territory. And I was afraid of how it might be received by people, if they would be offended by the idea of Blackness and queerness being discussed in this way during this time. And so with trepidation, I did indeed begin to write what would eventually become The Prophets in that first semester. That was in 2006, the fall of 2006, where I first started sketching out these characters and the world that they lived in.
And what kept you going through the last 14 years? You have quite a reputation as a journalist in any case. Is that what you relied on in terms of your income as you wrote this book?
Well, I would not call myself a journalist,
No.
because um, I don't have the objectivity, the alleged objectivity of a journalist. I am very clear on positions that I take. But I was writing, as I worked in the communications and marketing department of my alma mater as a writer who wrote about, uh, our professors and our alumni and the work of our students and such. And that is how I survived while writing this book. In undergrad, I worked 3 part-time jobs, including a job as a salesperson at the Scholastic store. Scholastic is the children's publisher. In grad school, I had 2 part-time jobs. And then when I graduated, I had this full-time job at my alma mater, and it was really difficult to find time to write this book. I had to write, going back to Toni Morrison again, at the edges of the day, because the work that I was doing took up so much of my creative energy and my time. So I would wake up at the magic hour, the witching hour, 3 a.m., and I would write for an hour, go back to sleep, wake up at 6 a.m. to get ready for work. And I would write on my commute on the subway train or on the bus and that is partly why it took me 14 years to write this book. But the other part was the emotional and psychological toll of writing about this time period. And what kept me going was a bit spiritual and a bit metaphysical, in that it was the voices that I heard, who I interpret as the ancestors, who said to me in no uncertain terms, we actually lived this, we experienced this, and we have given you the gift of witnessing it. The least you can do is continue to write.
Perhaps now is a good moment, Robert, to hear the voice of the ancestors.
Oh,
If you could kindly read a passage from the book for us.
oh, absolutely. I will read from a chapter called Maccabees. This is where Samuel and Isaiah, the 2 main characters who are 2 enslaved men in love, they receive a bit of bad news. I will not spoil what that bad news is, but this is how they sort of deal with it in a place where they really have no power. Timothy called for me. Samuel mumbled again. Isaiah took a deep breath and held it. He let it out. Then, because what else could he do, he shrugged. Silently, grief shook his body. Don't, Samuel said, standing still in the same spot, holding the cloth in his left hand. Don't what? Cry or shrug? Isaiah didn't know, and he was too tired to ask, but he did think about the ways in which his body wasn't his own, and how that condition showed up uniquely for everyone whose personhood wasn't just disputed, but denied. Swirling beneath him were the ways in which not having lawful claim to yourself diminished you, yes, but in another way, condemned those who invented the disconnection. He hoped. Maybe not in this realm, but absolutely in others, if there were others. Matching hard for hard did nothing but create wreckage, but being soft, while beautiful, was subject to being torn asunder by the harder thing. What other answer was there then, but to be some kind of flexible, stretch further, so that there was too much difficulty in trying to pull you apart? Samuel was a hard thing. There was no use in trying to make him anything other than that. And he had every right, even if sometimes he didn't understand how his rigidity, that impenetrable door that Pua was perhaps the first one to notice, was built up in the wrong direction. But some people thought hard was the answer and believed that rather than bend, you had to try to snap them in half because they were confident that you couldn't. Isaiah, however, knew of the sporadic but attendant softness inside Samuel. Ground cover rocky, yes, but soil giving. And Samuel only half trusted him with that knowledge, preferred, actually, if Isaiah didn't know at all. So some things he kept to himself. The shadow with the pointing hand would be one of them. It was in the barn, he could admit to that, but it wasn't in the woods or riding Maggie's back like a strapped babe. A mutual sigh released them from having to continue the argument. No one had to willingly relent or gloat over a victory. The inhalation, then exhalation of breath provided enough room for them to both hold on to a little bit of dignity, even in the middle of desecration. Samuel looked down at the bundle in his hand. He looked up and motioned with his head for Isaiah to follow him as he walked around to the back of the barn. Isaiah walked behind him, tracing Samuel's steps, walking in them sometimes, and sometimes making his own path through the chicory and spurge. When they came to the rear center of the barn, where the sun was bright with anger, and the knothole that betrayed them was a kind of memorial, Samuel stopped. Isaiah walked a bit farther, to where there was a little bit of shade because a yellow pine, not 30 years old yet, was in the process of spreading itself there, and he found its scent reassuring because of the way it hid his own. He turned to look at Samuel. Moving against his nature because there was the possibility of accusatory shadow, he walked over to where Isaiah was and sat down at the base of the tree. Isaiah sat down next to him. Samuel flattened his lap and unfastened Maggie's cloth. And what did they have here? A veritable feast of boiled eggs, fried ham, blackberry jelly on thick slices of bread, 2 whole nectarines, and a big old hunk of brown cake. Mercy, Isaiah said. Samuel didn't want to remember the shadow he didn't see. He picked up a nectarine and gestured for Isaiah to take one for himself. Almost at the same time, they bit into them. The juices ran down their faces. Isaiah wiped the juice away, but Samuel didn't. He stared ahead at the rear of the barn. Neither of them spoke, but they each continued to eat, picking things from the cloth, slowly, carefully, one with grateful hands, the other with discerning ones, like ritual, but without prayer because they didn't need one, and respect was freely given. But still, it was solemn-like, holy, as unto a last supper.
Wonderful. Actually, somebody has asked if there is an audio version of the book available. And would you think of recording it?
Oh, there is. I do not want to record it myself. I do not like my own voice.
Oh, you have a beautiful speaking voice.
Well, thank you very much. But there is an audiobook, and it is narrated by the wonderful, wonderful Karen Chilton, who did an amazing job, and in my estimation has elevated this work to levels that I could never achieve on my own.
Great. Okay. The passage you were reading there reminds us that, I guess you could call it the driving force or the plot. The main force in the plot is this love story between these 2 young men, teenagers, I presume. How important was that as the fulcrum for the book?
Oh, it was absolutely crucial. The entire reason I wrote The Prophets was because as an undergraduate student who minored in Africana studies, what was terribly clear to me was the erasure of Black queer figures in the historical narrative, at least prior to the period we know as the Harlem Renaissance in the United States, which was in about the 1920s. And I wanted to know where the Black queer figures were before that. and scoured the canon looking for examples, and could only find instances in which these Black queer characters were depicted as maybe depraved, excuse me, as victims of rape culture and sexual assault. But my question was, well, what about love? And because I could find it nowhere, I had to invent it. But also understanding that this had to have happened. There had to have been Black queer people in existence in this time, even if we did not have the language to call them such. And that is why I felt like I had to write this book.
And you somehow manage not to let that overwhelm the narrative, just as you also achieve the amazing feat of not allowing the horrific circumstances of daily life on the plantation to overwhelm the reader. But at the same time, there's no escape from it. It's there all the time.
Clearly, for me, and in my research, it just reconfirmed this for me, or affirmed this for me. Slavery is synonymous with violence. It was one of the most violent events in American history and global history. So I wanted to ensure that it was clear to the reader, and that I wasn't trying to hide the fact that slavery was abominable. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that slavery was not the star of the show, that the enslaved were depicted with their full humanity in a way that was three-dimensional, such that these characters felt human and real. And so I foregrounded them and their lives, and their interior lives in particular, so that readers could understand them as people, people who are having terrible things done to them, and that they are not the terrible thing itself. So yes, that was quite intentional, and I learned a great deal from Toni Morrison's Beloved in that particular sense.
How much of an emotional toll did it take on you yourself to confront those sordid realities of the daily life on the plantation and the suffering of those people?
It was quite trying. It was quite difficult to imagine these circumstances or read about them in the historical works. But there was always a voice inside me to whom I attribute to my own ancestors that compelled me to keep writing through the pain, because I wasn't the one that actually experienced it. I might be living in the legacy of that pain and that cruelty, but I wasn't the one who actually endured it as such. I am descended from the people who survived it so that I might be here to witness it on their behalf, to share their testimony. And that is sort of what kept me going in the trying moments when I wanted to put it down, when I was afraid to write it, when I thought I did not have the requisite skill to tell it, when it overwhelmed and I had to walk away to play with my nieces and nephews, or take long walks to bring myself back to this present moment, which in itself was not much of an escape. If you understand American history, you could see how so much of it repeats itself, in that we are now dealing with, in the 21st century, Black people having to announce that our lives matter, for people to see that this is the case, that we are in fact human beings, despite points of view to the contrary. So what kept me going was those voices, and the fact that I knew that this story had to be told, and that as the artist telling it, part of the sacrifice of art making, is pain. So I had to endure it.
The choreography of the book is quite something. I mean, such a wonderful cast of characters, each shining with their own personality. It's one of the most beautiful things about the book. How did you manage that feat? I mean, of imagination to come up with such a large cast of, memorable individuals with, real individual lives of their own, fully felt by the reader.
I attribute that to the fact that one of the things that I can say that I am is an astute watcher of human behavior. So I was very keen to pay attention to for example, other subway riders I was on the commute to work with, to
Yeah.
watch their personal tics and personalities, the people that I worked with, the people in my family, friends, people walking on the street. I intently studied everything from their movements to their speech patterns, everything, such that when I used that energy to sort of make these characters into people, all of that real sort of dimensionality comes through. I was also a big student of Black writers, particularly Black women writers. So the works of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston and so many others, and watching how they rendered these characters and how they told these stories played a huge role in me understanding how to render character on the page in a literary sense.
And talking of the characters, I mean, it's you also capture very well the character of Mississippi and the terrain which the plantation is set. I mean, did you go to Mississippi? Are you familiar with the place where the novel is set?
I did not go to Mississippi. I did, though, ask family members that I have in Mississippi if they could please tell me things about it. Like, what does the dirt feel like? When it rains, what does the sky look like? What are the smells of Mississippi? What kind of flowers bloom there? And then I did a lot of online research. I looked at videos of particular parts of Mississippi, and just to get a sense of what Mississippi was like. But then I also drew on some of my own personal experiences in the American South. So while I have never been to Mississippi, I do have family in South Carolina and Georgia. Those are places I have been. And I used my childhood experiences of playing on an actual plantation, which I did not know at the time that I was playing on a plantation. And I drew upon those moments to sort of create the world in which these characters live and breathe.
And the women are very well drawn, I have to say. I mean,
thank you.
How did you manage that? I mean, they are some of the strongest characters in the book are actually the women, no?
Oh, well, thank you. And I was intentional about ensuring that the women characters in particular were well drawn, not simply to escape criticism from women who might have been rightly upset or disturbed if I had made these characters flat or stereotypical, but also because women too are human beings, are part of this landscape, and should be rendered as respectfully and as clearly as I could possibly do within my own power as an artist. I drew upon the works of Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston to help guide me through that, as well as the women in my life, whether friends or relatives, particularly the elder women in my life, like my great aunts, who are no longer with us, but I recall them from my memory, to ensure that these women felt real, that they were given their strengths and vulnerabilities, and that they were fully human.
And then another great feat of the imagination, perhaps one of the greatest in the book, is your ability to get inside the heads of the white family that owned this plantation and the overseers. I mean, that cannot have been a pleasant or easy task for you, but I must say it's quite amazing that they turn out. They're not actually cartoonish figures. You know, they have a real life and a real presence in the book, and very plausible and credible, no matter how horrific they are as characters in real life.
Well, as much as I love comic books, to this day, I still read comic books 40 something years later since my father gave me my first. I did not want to write one with this book. And so there are good people and there are bad people, and there are bad people and there are good people, and sometimes they're both. And that is what humanity often is. It is a group of people stumbling and failing and doing wrong and sometimes doing right. And even the white characters in this situation had reasons for what they did. And I wanted to investigate what those reasons were. And I found some of them abominable. Paul, in particular, the plantation owner, he was the most difficult character to render because it felt almost like a betrayal to my ancestors to give him his fully rounded humanity when I wanted so much for him to be a monster. But as one of the characters says in the book, there actually are no monsters. They're just human beings doing horrible things to one another. And so from that foundation, I said to myself, that's right. There are no monsters. There are just human beings who sometimes do horrible things to one another. And so let me find out what in Paul's life, for example, led him to do these horrible things that he's doing. And Paul opened up to me to tell me exactly what in his life led him to what he believes is right, but it is actually wrong.
There's one amazing moment in the book where Paul, he's drunk, and he stands in front of his own son, who's who he treats as a slave, and he almost comes to the point of recognizing him and almost expressing love for him. And the moment is just gone. But I mean, that was quite something to conjure up that sort of epiphany, or almost like a veil falling away to reveal some kind of humanity in the man.
My grandmother used to say something to the effect of, liquor will have tongues wagging when they're usually tied. And that is and that is the truth, that people under the influence often feel a kind of courage or ability to face truth that they normally cannot. And in that moment, Paul's vulnerability is revealed, that he does understand that this character, Adam, is flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, despite the institution and the structures in which Paul and Adam are placed, which say that Adam must be subjugated. And that is a moment that we see a bit of humanity in Paul, a humanity that he normally disrespects and disregards.
And which he largely manages to suppress quite successfully.
Indeed.
Are we seeing in this book a kind of a moral collapse of America, you know, after the Declaration of Independence and before the Civil War? I mean, it's quite shocking to think of a country that aspires to the greatness that America aspires to, you know, could sink to such depths of depravity and cruelty in order to build up its wealth and strength.
Well, one must remember that this country we call the United States of America began in a very depraved place, with the extermination of its indigenous population and the enslavement of the kidnapped Africans. The country that spoke out of both sides of its mouth was at once saying, all men are created equal and give us liberty or give us death, while chaining and killing another part of the population. And that is the unusual dichotomy of this country that we keep reliving over and over and over again because the country is unable to face its history. So the America of the mythical imagination. I don't understand America as this land of the free, home of the brave. That has always struck me as propaganda. The only America I have ever known, and this is the historical record as well as my own personal experience, is an America that's built on the lie that in order to be tall, someone else has to be on their knees, to paraphrase Toni Morrison. And this country is chief among those. And maybe that is how nations are built, by subjugating other people. And so I think it behooves us as a human species to begin to look at the ways in which we are organizing our societies, and to determine whether this is just. Is this what we want to be?
I have a question here from Lynn, who asks, are there more stories to tell about these characters?
Perhaps. I am not sure if I will ever return to any of the characters in this book, because there's so many other things I wish to write about, and there's so little time. I'm going to be 50 this year. I probably won't have another 50 years on this planet. So I do want to tell other stories, but there is one character in particular who continues to pique my curiosity, and that is King Akusa from the pre-colonial African chapters of the novel. And I think maybe one day I might return to her if I have the courage, but for now there are no plans to do so.
Robert, would you like to read another passage from the book? Perhaps the voice of the ancestors.
Oh, yes, I would love to read from the book. I will read from the opening chapter, in fact, called Judges. And this is where we are first introduced to the ancestral voices that play throughout the novel.
Wonderful.
You do not yet know us. You do not yet understand. We who are from the dark, speaking in the seven voices, because seven is the only divine number, because that is who we are and who we have always been. And this is law. By the end, you will know, and you will ask why we did not tell you sooner. Do you think you are the first to have asked this question? You are not. There is, however, an answer. There is always an answer, but you have not yet earned it. You do not know who you are. How could you possibly reckon with who we are? You are not lost so much as you are betrayed by fools who mistook glimmer for power. They gave away all the symbols that hold sway. The penance for this is lasting. Your blood will have long been diluted by the time reason finally takes hold. Or the world itself will have been reduced to ash, making memory beside the point. But yes, you have been wronged, and you will do wrong again and again and again, until finally you wake, which is why we are here, speaking with you now. A story is coming. Your story is coming. It is the whole purpose of your being there here. The first time you arrived, you were not in chains. You were greeted warmly and exchanged food, art, and purpose with those who knew that neither people nor land should be owned. Our responsibility is to tell you the truth. But since you were never told the truth, you will believe it a lie. Lies are more affectionate than truth and embrace with both arms. Prying you loose is our punishment. Yes, we too have been punished. We all have. Because there are no innocents. Innocence, we have discovered, is the most serious atrocity of all. It is what separates the living from the dead. Eh? What this now? Forgive our laughter. You thought you were the living and we were the dead? Ha!
Wonderful. And we do know them by the end of the book, I think, to some extent, as far as we can. How important was it for you to capture that period before the horror began, and to give life to the lineage of these people before they set foot in America?
It was extraordinarily important, because though we are separated by land and sea, we are connected by blood to those on the African continent. And I wanted to ensure that everyone in the African diaspora, wherever they are, whether it is in, say, Nigeria or England or Canada or Brazil or the United States, I wanted to ensure that we understood that we were all connected. And one of the ways in which that connection was possible was through the ancestral voice, which speaks in what some people call blood memory. We understand these things through blood, our very blood. And the line, the very beginning, "You do not yet know us," came to me in a dream. And it was to me a way that the ancestors were talking to me and telling me that they too wanted to be a part of this book, in talk directly to me and directly to the other characters in the book, and directly to the readers as well, because there was something that they had to say.
The closing chapters of the book are quite brilliant, cinematic, I would say, and they give light to the fact, to the perhaps misperception that the slave population in America did not have agency or did not fight back. It's a wonderful sense of rebellion stirring throughout the book. Finally, it bursts like a flood.
Yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to ensure came through. There were hundreds of rebellions, if not thousands, during the period between the 1500s, when the first Africans arrived here enslaved, until the official end of slavery in 1865. But it actually continued much past that, in other forms, and maybe even to this day, through the use of the prison industrial complex. But it was important for me to note that these were not just passive people. Some of them were afraid. And that is, I think, a human response, to be afraid of people with more power than you, who are holding all of the weapons and all of the wealth. But there were others who pushed past that fear to attempt to free themselves, who were really inspired and thought about that phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." The people who initially said that were not, my ancestors were not on their minds when they said that line, but my ancestors indeed believed, "Give me liberty or give me death," that they should not be bound in chains and forced to work for free, and all the other horrors that should befall them. And so they tried very many times, unsuccessfully, to free themselves through the use of violent uprising. We know some of the tales, Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, but we don't know all of them. And there were so many.
Haiti is the one that stands out most for us, I think. The successful rebellion in Haiti, where they overturned the French rule there.
Something that Haiti continues to pay for to this day.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Do you think there's any hope at all for white patriarchy and white supremacism? I mean, you're very conscious of that in your writing, I think, and that it continues to this day in many forms. I mean, when you were writing the book over the last 14 years, the history of America has been fascinating to watch, going from first black president to a character as ludicrous as Donald Trump. How do you explain that, or how do you get your head around that as a black American writer?
It makes all the sense in the world coming from the American citizenry. What you saw in that, Barack Obama, who I must say could not have been president if he did not have a white mother. If he was not raised by the white members of his family, he would not have been embraced the way he was. If he had a black mother and father and was raised in a black household by black people, the American people would not have wholesale embraced him. They had to be assured that he had some proximity to whiteness and that he would not do anything to usurp the status quo to say, okay, we will give him a chance. But even that, a biracial black person like Barack Obama stroked such fear and loathing in the American imagination that they said, the next president we're going to elect is going to be the least qualified white man we could find on the planet Earth. To prove to you that electing a black man was no big deal.
Right. We can replace him with a white buffoon, just to make the point.
Just to make the point.
Yeah. How much is your book actually capturing the current moment in American history? You know, with all that's happened over the last 6 or 7 years since Black Lives Matter was inaugurated.
My goodness. What I was struck by while writing this book, while researching it too, was the ways in which attacks upon the black body have remained consistent for hundreds of years. So, for example, we no longer have black people picking cotton on plantations in the South, but now we have the prison industrial complex in which black bodies are forced to do labor in very similar ways, without payment, without right. We no longer have plantation owners or slave overseers whipping us or chaining us during antebellum slavery like they did then. But now we have police officers who, with impunity, without compunction, murder us on camera and suffer no consequences for doing it. So anti-blackness has been remarkably resilient and has this really uncanny ability to sort of change to fit the modes and mores of whatever time it's in. And it is stunning to watch how similar. I'm writing about the 1800s, and we are now in the 21st century, and so many things are the same.
Do you see any hope?
James Baldwin once said that I have to be an optimist because what do I tell the children? So I am an optimist. The young people in particular give me so much hope. The way they are critiquing, resisting, thinking of new ways to organize society, thinking about new ways to think about humanity and the ways we treat the planet, and so on and so forth. That gives me hope. Our generations and older, I have no hope for us. We are dead set on status quo. We are terrified of young people and the ways they think about gender and race and sexuality and gender identity. We don't recognize the world, and we want it back to the way we can interpret it. But maybe the children will save us. Maybe, if we don't blow up the world, if we leave them a world in which that's not toxic and poisonous, maybe they have a chance of changing it.
I think you could be right. I was on the Black Lives Matter march here in Geneva in May, and I've never, ever seen so many people out on the streets of Geneva, you know, of all races, of all colors, and mainly young people. and very vocal and peaceful, but very vocal. So it's quite amazing. I mean, it's an electrifying thing that's happened, in terms of the way it has spread from America. This anger at institutionalized racism that we've seen over the last couple of years, and especially I think social media has really brought it into perspective. No?
Yes, indeed. Social media has, it's a double-edged sword, social media, because sometimes it can be quite the cruel place, but it is also a place where movements can be seen. People can communicate with people that they normally could not have, and ideas about ways in which we can all be liberated can be spread.
So, Robert, a couple more questions for you. What advice do you have for young writers struggling to find their voice? This is from Rosemary. Yeah, I think she's in Australia.
Oh, Rosemary, thank you for that question. Um, the world loves reading, but they despise writers because at the writer's fingertip is the truth. And most people do not like to look into mirrors, and writers provide mirrors for people to look into. And so we don't cultivate writers. We don't allow young writers, children, teenagers, young adults who are writing, maybe even older people who are writing. We don't let them know that writing is actually a worthy endeavor. Like doctors and lawyers and engineers, we need writers. We don't treat the arts in that same way. We treat art making as a frivolous idea, or as a hobby, or something that only the creme de la creme, the elite, have time to dabble in. But it is indeed the ways in which we separate ourselves from other species on this planet is we do art. And so I say to young writers writing, find in yourself, even if you're terrified that what you're writing no one will read, or that what you're writing isn't good enough, or that no one else in the world will understand what it is you're putting together, do it anyway. Because the fact that you are doing it means that you were supposed to be doing it. You are here. You have a purpose, and that purpose is to write. And it is to write under any circumstances, over any obstacles. Please continue to write, no matter what the inner critic is telling you, because I have heard that inner critic, and I still hear it to this day, always telling you you're not good enough. Write anyway.
How helpful did you find it to do an MFA?
Oh, I found it incredibly helpful in these ways. One, it taught me how to take and give criticism, which is a lost art form. We really need to be instilling in our society, in our young people, how to both take criticism and give it. So the MFA program taught me really great ways to think about that. It also gave me sort of like a case study of how my work would be received by certain demographics, because oftentimes my white classmates were unsettled by the things that I was writing about, because they would say, you're writing about race. And I did not have the language then to tell them, you are also writing about race. Whiteness is not default state of humanity. White is also a race. But it made me understand, those are the things I'm going to be experiencing as I move along this journey of being a published writer. So for those two reasons, the MFA program, I think, was invaluable.
Great. A question from someone who's obviously read the book. I won't say anything to explain the reference, but perhaps you can give us an answer. Maybe you've answered it already. Could we expect a sequel telling us what happened to Isaiah and Pua? Well, actually, I personally would love to know what happened to them.
Okay, so I love that question, because my mother has her own interpretation of what happens at the at the end.
Yeah.
My mother believes, spoilers, slight spoilers, not big ones, that Isaiah's experience at the end of this chapter is actually him meeting up with Pua.
That's what I thought, actually.
That is my mother's interpretation.
Yeah.
So yes, there's all this sort of mystical stuff happening, but my mother said that at the end of the day, the what the ancestors are describing is Isaiah and Pua meeting up, and that the two of them together can now remember Samuel, and also go to whatever the next stage of this fight for liberation is. So that ending is completely open to interpretation, and intentionally so. And so a sequel in which we explore what that might have meant might undermine the ambiguity, the intentional ambiguity of that ending. So I don't think I will go there, but who knows?
Well, I will say that when Isaiah feels a hand on his foot as he's getting out of the river towards the end, I was just hoping that it was Pua holding on to him, but who knows? So, Robert, we're coming to the end of the glass hour, but we'd like to know what's next for Robert. And your fan base must be huge at this stage. You know, your fame is reaching everywhere, I think, certainly in the English-speaking world. I don't know if any translations are planned for the book or have any been done.
The book will be published in so many other countries that it's making my head spin. So there will be a French version, Swiss version, a Spanish version, it's being published in Israel, Brazil, Romania, which it just boggles my mind.
Fantastic.
Italy. So what's next for me, though, is once the fanfare sort of settles down for the prophets, I am 40 pages into another novel, and I'm hoping to turn my attention back to that project and work on my second novel.
And can you tell us anything about it?
I can tell you that all work that I do will always be from the lens of the intersection of Blackness and queerness, and that this novel is looking at another time period in American history, the 1980s about, and I will be exploring some things about that time period in this country.
Great. Well, Robert, here it is again, The Prophets. I urge everyone listening online to buy it. Don't buy it from Amazon if you can. Try and buy it from your local bookshop.
Please.
Yeah, you would agree with that, Robert?
Please support your independent local booksellers. Yes.
Yeah. And Robert, it's been fantastic to listen to you for the last hour. You've been such a wonderful guest and, very generous with your time. So thank you so much. And I hope at some future occasion we'll be able to welcome you in person.
That is my sincerest hope, that we get to meet you and that we get to meet in person and break bread together.
Yeah, and to meet the GLAS audience. They'd love to see you in the flesh.
Oh, I would love that.
To you. Yeah.
Maybe next year when things open, maybe things will open up again.
Have you got a vaccination yet?
I am scheduled for tomorrow.
Good man. The best of luck with it.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Good night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.